Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Bill Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, about whether we're headed toward World War III, how seriously we should take Russia's threats of nuclear war, and how the U.S. can help put Ukraine in the best possible bargaining position to end the war. And then we'll dive into the latest from the Middle East, including what Israel might do next to retaliate against Iran, and we'll examine a troubling new report about the terror threat to the American homeland. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Really excited for this episode. We have Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, now at the U.S. Institute of Peace, coming up later on. He's got a lot of great insights on whether we're on the verge of World War III, whether we should take seriously Russia's threats of nuclear annihilation, and a lot of other really great takes from Bill. So stay tuned for that. But first things first, Guy, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here on the Threat Status Podcast for another week. While the Israel-Iran escalation is certainly on my radar, and we're going to discuss that as well as some major Ukraine war developments in a little bit here, something else has really grabbed my attention in recent days. It was an article penned by Secretary of State Antony Blinken that was published by Foreign Affairs magazine on October 1. In the article, Blinken calls out the growing alignment between Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, writing that they are, quote, determined to alter the foundational principles of the international system, that they all want to entrench autocratic rule at home and assert spheres of influence abroad, that they all wish to resolve territorial disputes by coercion or force and weaponize other countries' economic and energy dependence, and that they all seek to erode the foundations of the United States' strength, its military and technological superiority, its dominant currency, and its unmatched network of alliances and partnerships. End quote. That is not an exact quote, but very close to it, and I encourage people to go read it for themselves. This article basically leapt off the page at me, Ben, because, as you know, I've spent more or less the past 4 years writing about this growing alignment, and my reporting has highlighted some scholars who call it a, quote, axis of authoritarianism, end quote. I've, of course, also highlighted scholars who say it's not an axis, but more of an alignment of convenience. At Threat Status, we're constantly seeking sources who can clarify what the actual tissue of relations is between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea across the so-called DIME, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic spheres. Where does that tissue exist? Weapons transfers, backdoor sanctions evading oil deals, troop and naval asset movements, signals, intelligence sharing, and so on. What's most interesting to me, Ben, is that the Biden administration publicly has been more or less loath to talk openly about this group of adversaries as an aligned bloc. Publicly, administration officials talk about each country individually. The reason for this, I believe, is that there's a consensus within the administration against the notion of actively engaging in a so-called wedge strategy geopolitically that would be designed to drive a wedge between China and Russia or between Russia and Iran, etc. Either that or the administration is wary of how economically entangled the U.S. is with China, an entanglement that acts as a kind of deterrence, or at least finds Biden administration officials self-censoring their remarks linking China to Iran and Russia and North Korea out of fear Beijing may get angry and create economic problems for the U.S. that in turn hurt the Biden administration and the Democratic Party's chances of holding the White House into another term. It could be a lot of things. It could be that the administration fears making the alignment appear more powerful to the rest of the world by characterizing it as a truly cohesive bloc. I will tell you, Ben, that I have met Antony Blinken a few times in my reporting over the years. I do not know him well, but we have mutual friends or contacts as it goes at that level of the foreign policy machine. Anyhow, I was struck back when he was Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. I was struck by how hawkish he was in comparison to then Secretary of State John Kerry. I think what's interesting here is that Blinken has not been very hawkish as Secretary of State himself in the Biden administration. It's only now, as he approaches the final weeks of his tenure as America's top diplomat. He said he'll be leaving the post even if Vice President Harris wins the presidency. As he approaches his final weeks, he appears to have come out swinging with this foreign affairs piece and telling it like it is. One thing, Ben, is that in the piece, Blinken actually still goes out of his way to kind of adhere to Biden administration anti-wedge strategy dogma. For instance, he writes that Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea are, quote, not an axis, and that the administration has been clear that it does not seek bloc confrontation, end quote. He also writes that choices that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are making mean that the U.S. needs to, quote, act decisively to prevent that outcome.
It's fascinating. I mean, why he would choose to do this now. And let's also remember here, we had Chris Sabatini from Chatham House on the show a couple weeks ago, guy who said Venezuela should be added to that list as well of the axis of authoritarians. So it's a fluid situation. And, I'd be curious to see what Secretary Blinken thinks about that as well.
It factors into the presidential election. How a Trump administration may confront this versus a Harris administration. And I think the jury's out. People make arguments both ways. Some say, oh, Trump will handle this. He's going to be way more effective. I've heard people in off the record settings say that. And I've heard people from the other side say, no, Kamala Harris is right for it because she was part of the Biden administration in passing industrial legislation in recent years, namely the CHIPS Act.
Well, look, speaking of Iran, the axis of authoritarians, I mean, things are moving fast in the Middle East, Guy, as you suggested earlier. And look, just since last week's show, Israel's carried out an airstrike in Lebanon that killed Hassan Nasrallah, the longtime leader of Hezbollah, launched more strikes against the Houthis, sent ground troops into southern Lebanon. Iran responded by launching another ballistic missile attack against Israel that was defeated by U.S. and Israeli defenses with minimal damage to Israel, thankfully. That's just over the past 6 days or so. So it's a little hard to keep up with how fast things are moving. But as we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, the focus now is on what Israel's going to do next.
Right, Ben. Don't forget that an interesting thing you didn't mention is that Saudi Arabia, Iran's major rival in the wealthy Gulf Arab world, announced that it will be resuming cash aid to the Palestinian Authority government in the West Bank. I'm still talking with people about how that fits into the evolving puzzle here, but it's a key development.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like that's one of the many key developments that are happening quickly. I think the most immediate questions, most immediate concerns, at least, are the targets inside Iran that Israel is going to strike. President Biden made clear that the U.S. does not support Israeli strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, which would generally be considered, I think, close to the top of the escalatory ladder, if you will, in terms of potential targets inside Iran. Now, Biden said today, just a couple hours before we started to record, that the U.S. is discussing with Israel the possibility of hitting Iran's oil production facilities, and that, as you might expect, caused an immediate spike in crude oil prices. So that's a good reminder, I think, about the real world ramifications of what's going on in the Middle East for all of us. But Guy, I wonder how far Israel's going to go. You and I, we talked off air yesterday a little bit about how to some degree we've seen this movie before, right? Major Israeli offensives, military incursions into Lebanon, airstrikes, even the targeting before to limited degrees of Iran's nuclear program. So it's very possible that this all doesn't blow up into a massive world altering war that some people fear. But there are still some signs this could be different. And I wonder if there's almost a perfect storm materializing that could motivate Israel to really go for the throat this time and destroy the ability of Iran and its proxies once and for all to threaten Israel. The first, of course, is October 7th, the Hamas attacks, which sparked this Israeli military operation we're seeing now in the first place. But there's a lot of other things here. And one of them is this question of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself. A few weeks ago on the show, you might remember, I mentioned how he's 74 years old, and I wonder if he's thinking about how he wants to be remembered. Well, right now, Iran and the axis of resistance is reeling. I mean, Hezbollah looks kind of leaderless and vulnerable. Does Netanyahu think he can cement his legacy right now as the guy who permanently secured Israel and eliminated these threats? Maybe so. And by the way, there might be good reason for him to think that because his poll numbers have gone up recently. A recent Channel 12 poll in Israel found that Israelis prefer Netanyahu as prime minister over former defense minister Benny Gantz and opposition leader Yair Lapid. Israelis picked former prime minister Naftali Bennett over Netanyahu by 3 percentage points, but the gap between those men was 11 percentage points just a few months ago. That same poll found that 53% of Israelis said Netanyahu's doing a bad job and 43% said he's doing a good job. But 2 weeks ago, that same poll by Channel 12 found 60% of Israelis said he's doing a bad job and only 35% said he's doing a good job. So look, I mean, Netanyahu's been besieged, as we've talked about extensively here, by public anger protests over Israel's inability to bring home the hostages still held by Hamas. And let's not forget, his political obituary was essentially being written before October 7th as he was facing criticism from all political sides, a corruption trial, and a fact that a lot of Israelis just seem to be plain sick of him. But now, as Israel ramps up its military campaign against Iran and its proxies, he's getting more popular personally, which leads me to the final point, Guy, of why I think there could be a chance Israel really pushes the envelope here. It's already withstood about as much public criticism as one can imagine. When you look at all of the verbal broadsides Israel's gotten over the way it's conducted the war against Hamas and Gaza, including from plenty of folks here in the United States, what's left to say that hasn't been said? I mean, certainly the United States has levers it can pull, like cutting off arms to Israel if it wants to do that. But we've shown a reluctance to do that outside of a couple of isolated incidents over the past year. As a matter of fact, this time around, the Biden administration has signaled the U.S. is going to help Israel strike back at Iran. So, look, all of that, I guess, could be creating a unique moment here. If Israel ever wanted the opportunity to truly eliminate Iran and the axis of resistance as threats to the Jewish state, I wonder, Guy, it's hard for me to imagine that they're going to get a better chance than the one they seem to have in front of them right now.
It's a great question, Ben. Let's just hope that we're not staring down the barrel of World War III. Ambassador William B. Taylor is Vice President of the Europe and Russia programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. He was previously U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. He's a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School. He served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Ambassador Taylor, we're honored and flattered to have you. Thank you for joining the Threat Status podcast.
Guy, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
Ambassador, a few months ago, I was out at Stanford University where I interviewed Philip Zelikow, the diplomat turned historian, and he basically told me that he felt that humanity was more or less closer to global conflict than it has been in really a generation. He talked about the alignment of Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. Interestingly, Secretary of State Blinken has a piece that has just come out this week in Foreign Affairs, more or less pointing out a similar theme, talking about that alignment. Given what we're seeing now with war in Ukraine, war in Sudan, war in Myanmar, war in the Middle East, the threat of Chinese possible military action toward Taiwan. What are your thoughts on this situation that we're in? Are we closer to World War right now, or has it already started?
I don't think it's already started. I share all the concerns about the various hotspots and conflict and potential flashpoints that you just described and that Secretary Blinken notes, it of course doesn't have to be. I mean, it's our job. It's his job in the first instance, but it's your job and my job, Guy, to help think through what it is that we can do to make the world a better place and to steer away from a major conflict.
Let's look specifically at Ukraine. You were just there recently. What were you working on?
So I've been there 8 times now since the big war started, a bunch of more times since the war started in 2014. But since February of 2022, 8 times. I'll be there again next week. As you indicate in your question, there are a couple of projects that I'm working on. One has to do with Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. He had a peace summit in Switzerland in June. He's talking about what a peace looks like, just and lasting peace, what it looks like, what are the characteristics, how do you get there? We're also doing some work, Guy, on defense industrial issues. You know, the Ukrainians are doing amazing things on their own with various weapons, but in particular drones. I mean, I was there a week and a half ago, visited a couple of different drone manufacturing, one great big and one small. One of those two facilities was run by a non-governmental organization in the basement of an apartment building in Kyiv. And they were doing some really innovative stuff. So I got to believe that on net, the Ukrainians have an advantage in that. But that's one of the things that we're working on as well.
I want to look at the Biden administration's policy and U.S. policy in general over the last 2 years with regard to Ukraine. Just last week, we saw the White House announce another $2.4 billion in American aid to Ukraine. The U.S. has committed about $60 billion in direct military assistance since February 2022. That is specifically military aid. There are other forms of support, but the Biden administration has been slow to provide certain capabilities that Ukraine has asked for, whether it's HIMARS, ATACMS, battle tanks, F-16s. How do you grade the Biden administration's approach to the Ukraine-Russia war so far?
So you're exactly right. They have been cautious. And on every one of those decisions that you mentioned, there have been discussions, debates, arguments within the administration, as well as input from the Congress, as well as input from the people, the American people, about whether or not to take that next step, whether it's the F-16s or the ATACMS, or the permission to shoot into Russia using American weapons at military targets. They've, of course, given that, and they made these other decisions on weapon systems, but they also gave the Ukrainians the okay to use weapons within a small box inside Russia. And the real question now is, will the administration, after the deliberations that are going on right now, pros and cons, give the Ukrainians the authority to use the weapons that we've given them and others, because it affects the British and the French as well. Will the administration give the Ukrainians the authority to use those weapons deep into Russia against military targets? Question is whether they'll get the authority to shoot deep. I think will come. If the past is, and the pattern that we've seen in the past is any indication, I think they will make that decision as well.
Ambassador, it's Ben Wolfgang. One of the reasons, at least it appears to me, that the administration has sometimes, gone a little bit slowly with some of those decisions is because of this fear of escalation, which we've heard, both in the Ukraine-Russia war and now in the Middle East as well. The Biden administration's desire to prevent and avoid escalation is central to its calculus here. So I think it's fair to say, at least it looks to me, that some of the Kremlin's, nuclear saber-rattling and other threatening and sometimes almost borderline apocalyptic language may have worked. I mean, you've lived and worked in that part of the world for a long time. How seriously do you take it when, Putin or Dmitry Medvedev or some other Russian official talks about escalation, nuclear war, or the destruction of European cities and other over-the-top rhetoric we've seen? Should the U.S. be taking that seriously? And do you take it seriously and literally?
Ben, it's a great question. The answer is we should certainly take seriously the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons. I mean, that we know. However, you asked the right question: is should we take seriously all the bluster and bluff, which it has clearly been to a large extent, clearly been to a total extent up until now. It's been bluff. Should we take what Medvedev or even Putin says very seriously? I think the answer is no, that we shouldn't take that very seriously. We should take seriously the fact that they have nuclear weapons. We should also take seriously the fact that we have nuclear weapons and we have conventional weapons, and deterrence works. Deterrence has worked on both sides. They have not Russians have not attacked a NATO member. The Georgians and the Ukrainians wanted to be members of NATO back in 2008. And the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 said no. And 4 months later, the Russians invaded Georgia, and 6 years later, they invaded Ukraine. The Russians don't invade NATO nations, but they invade nations that are not members of NATO. So deterrence in terms of our capabilities, as well as deterrence of our defensive alliance, NATO, works. This latest statement from Putin: "Oh, we changed our doctrine. We changed our doctrine. Now it makes it if there is a non-nuclear nation that is supported by a nuclear nation, and if that non-nuclear nation attacks us, then it's actually we'll have to take it seriously about the nuclear." Come on. I have a hard time paying attention to that kind of rhetoric. What you do have to pay attention to is any movement, any indication, any sign that they're serious about using nuclear weapons, of which there have been none. We'll probably see any movement of nuclear weapons and warheads being mated to the delivery systems and those kind of things. We may not see every one, but we have pretty good visibility, pretty good, not 100%, but pretty good visibility into what they're doing with their nuclear weapons. And so far, they're not giving any sign that they're serious about using these. And the last thing I'll say about that is there's no value to them to using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, or anywhere for that matter, but certainly not in Ukraine. Tactical nuclear weapons would give them no military value, and it would so further isolate them from the rest of the world, probably from even their own people, but certainly from like the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese have said to the Russians, shut up about this talk about nuclear weapons. And to some degree, it's kind of sunk into the Russians, but it doesn't stop them from, they can't help themselves.
I, for one, would have enjoyed being a fly on the wall of the room from which the Chinese made that phone call. That probably was a pretty interesting moment. I've got a kind of long two-part quasi-political question here regarding Ukrainian President Zelensky. For context, for listeners may not remember, you testified in 2019 in the first impeachment trial of then President Donald Trump about the alleged quid pro quo, in which Trump wanted then newly elected Zelensky to launch an investigation into Burisma, a company that had hired Hunter Biden. I don't want to go into rehashing all of that. Anyone who's interested, go read all about it. But Zelensky now, over the past couple of weeks, as the U.S. heads into this November 5 election, he's back at the forefront of U.S. politics. He visited an ammunition factory in Pennsylvania where he was joined by top state Democrats. That totally infuriated Republicans. Again, our listeners can go Google House Speaker Mike Johnson Zelensky, and you'll find lots of stories about that. But from where you sit, Ambassador Taylor, and all of the experiences that you've had being caught in the middle of, as a great American diplomat in domestic U.S. political firestorms, why does Zelensky keep up ending up in the middle of U.S. politics? One, and then do you also have concerns about Zelensky's standing in Ukraine at this point, given that his presidency has ended, the country is under martial law? Can his presidency continue indefinitely? This is something we've brought up on the podcast before, and we tend to get a lot of critical emails from people after. I think it's a fair question, though. How long does he stay in power?
Guy, two great questions. On your first, why does President Zelensky allow himself to get close to American politics. I think it's not intentional. I think
He was a comedian on television in Ukraine before he suddenly ran for politics. He didn't have a governorship in California the way Ronald Reagan did before he rose to the preeminence of American politics.
It's a fair point. It is a fair point. This is not the environment that he came up in. I've had many conversations with him in 2019, actually, as this was starting to play out, about the importance of bipartisan support in the United States, in particular in Washington, D.C. I told him, and we had this conversation, there's no more valuable asset for Ukraine than bipartisan support. And by and large, they had that. Even as late as this April vote on the $61 billion supplemental package for Ukraine, it was bipartisan. It was House and Senate. When you add up the number of Republicans in the House and the Senate, it was a majority of Republicans. So it was a overwhelming bipartisan support, and that's valuable. President Zelensky knows that. He knows how important that is. So he went to he went to Utah earlier and had a similar kind of a visit to Utah, a Republican governor, and had good conversations there. And then, yes, he went to Scranton to an ammunition plant, and again, his intent was, I'm sure, was to thank the American workers at that ammunition plant for the support they were giving to Ukraine. And so he did not see it as a political step. But as you say, this is his first political job. This is his first job in government. He's a pro now. I mean, he's been in there since 2019, so he's been in there for 5 years. So he's now can be qualified. It's legitimate to call him a professional politician, and by and large a good one. I think you would agree. I mean, he stepped up and led his nation in a horrible time, a crisis time, and has rallied the nation. I'm going to get to your second question because that's a good one, but has brought the Ukrainian people along. And they've brought him along. I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, they totally support him, and he has led them well, and has brought together the international community as well, the Americans and the Europeans, and all in a way that who would have expected? His constitution, the Ukrainian constitution, is very clear. You can't have elections when there's martial law. You can't have elections under martial law. And you have martial law as long as there is a war. Regularly, the Rada, the parliament, the Ukrainian parliament, extends martial law. So it's not the president who is doing this. It is the parliament that.
So there's an element of oversight happening in Kiev.
There's an element of oversight. Now, it is also true that the Rada majority is President Zelensky's party. It's his party is called Servant of the People, after his television show, by the way, does have the majority in the Rada. But they do extend. The law says, and the law is clear, that as long as there is martial law extended regularly, or as long as the Congress or the Parliament, the Rada extends it, then they can't have election. Then the legitimacy of his extended presidency is not questioned by Ukrainians. So that part, that is clear. And then your second question is, will it go on indefinitely? The answer is no. When the war ends, there will definitely be an election.
Ambassador, we've only got a couple minutes here, but I do want to try to squeeze in a question quickly about the end game here. I mean, we're nearing the end of the U.S. presidential election, and Donald Trump, of course, has pledged to end the war quickly with some sort of negotiated settlement. Kamala Harris says we need to keep supporting Ukraine, and is a little bit less clear on those details about how, when, or if she'd push for a peace deal. But it's worth remembering, and I often mention this here on the show, that White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, all the way back in the spring of 2022, said that this war will end at the negotiating table and the U.S. needs to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position when that happens. So isn't that still the case? And if so, do you think now is the moment to push for a deal? Because Ukraine's military offensive in Kursk has kind of shifted the dynamics a little bit on the battlefield here. So is it fair to say that Ukraine might never be in a better negotiating position than it's in right now?
No, Ben, I think they can be in a better position over the next, say, 6 months. It depends a lot on us. It definitely depends a lot on us. If we continue to provide them the stuff that they need, the ammunition, the authority to use these missiles, if we provide them what they need, they can do better. They can get they can be in a better position in 6 months. But you're right. Many people in Ukraine are thinking about how this ends. But that's what has to happen. It has to be Ukrainians thinking about how this ends. It's both the government and the people, and they lead each other and they follow each other and they interact with each other. The government and the people have to think about how this ends. They have to continue to fight, as you said, to get themselves in a good position, and indeed to force Putin to the conclusion that he can't win. I mean, that's what's got to happen. In order for there to be a negotiation, in order for this war to end, at least temporarily, Putin has to realize that he can't win, that the Ukrainians are never going to give up, that the Europeans are going to continue to support the Ukrainians, and the Americans are going to continue to support them as well. As long as that happens, then Putin is not going to win, and he's got to realize that. But that's one thing. The only way that the Ukrainians then decide when that happens is if Ukraine gets into NATO. I think this is a really important part. And in fact, I think Ukraine's assurance, the assurance to Ukraine that they will be in NATO will be what it will take for the Ukrainians to agree to end this war, because otherwise the Russians will keep coming.
Ambassador William Taylor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, headquartered across the street from the U.S. State Department, a few blocks from the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for speaking openly with us here and joining the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ambassador.
Guy, Ben, thank you very much for having me. It's been great talking to you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners, right now this week as you're listening to the show. Guy, what do you have as your threat of the week?
Thanks, Ben. My threat of the week is that the U.S. federal government has been slow to the take over the past several years in recognizing the growing alignment, call it an axis, call it a bloc, call it whatever you want, the growing anti-U.S. alignment of the world's most powerful autocratic and dictatorial powers, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. There are wars now raging, Ben, in Africa, the civil war in Sudan, in Asia, the civil war in Myanmar, in the Middle East, and in Europe, in Ukraine. And these four autocratic powers are in some way, directly or indirectly, deeply involved in all of these wars, while Cold War movements are playing out in the Western Hemisphere as well. My threat of the week is that by the time the U.S. government fully wakes up to this alignment, we may be in a global conflict like nothing we've seen since World War II.
Yeah, it's something you can't afford to be late to. I think there's a good argument that we are, or at least some of our decision makers are, to say the least. Guy, my threat of the week is the terror threat to the U.S. homeland. I had an exclusive story this week in the Washington Times about a new, quote, terror threat snapshot, unquote, produced by the House Homeland Security Committee. It didn't have any major new startling revelations in it, but it compiled a whole lot of troubling information and painted what I think is a pretty disturbing picture of the threats to, me, you, and all of us here in the U.S. right now. And there's two interwoven, interconnected aspects to this. One is the number of jihadist cases across the U.S. The report looks at more than 50 cases in at least 29 states since April 2021. Most of these are individuals charged with attempting to provide material support to terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, in some cases Hezbollah, and other groups. One of the cases cited is that of Asif Merchant, who we've discussed here in the show before, the Pakistani national with ties to Iran, who was charged earlier this year in an alleged murder-for-hire plot that seems to have been targeting former President Donald Trump. So on one hand, you have this increasing number of individuals in America who seem sympathetic to terrorist groups and apparently are willing to try to help them. And then on the other side of the equation, you have a resurgence of terrorist groups abroad. in Africa, in Afghanistan, elsewhere, ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, terror groups across the Sahel. These groups want to strike the U.S., as top military and law enforcement officials, including FBI Director Christopher Wray, have warned recently. Wray warned specifically in recent testimony to Congress that terrorists could try to copy the ISIS-K playbook from their March attack in Moscow, where they killed more than 140 people at a music hall there. So look, it's hard today for a terrorist group to pull off a 9/11 style attack. Not impossible, certainly, by any stretch, but definitely harder. We've instituted a host of protections as a country, as a society, to try to prevent that kind of major operation. So if a group wants to target the U.S., it is likely to be exactly what Christopher Wray warned about: a gunman, maybe a few of them, hitting soft targets like concert halls, schools, public events, and the like. So right now, guys, my threat of the week, because this House GOP report, I think, does a good job at connecting those two aspects, because whether we want to admit it or not, if terror groups are getting stronger abroad, that means they're becoming more of a threat to us here at home as well.
Interesting, Ben. I do want to point out and congratulate you that you were the very first to report on that Homeland Security report. And I know these things because as the national security editor at the Washington Times, I keep track of that stuff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to go read it as well. It's a fascinating and somewhat troubling report. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Guy. Thanks to Bill Taylor for joining us from the U.S. Institute of Peace. That was a fantastic interview earlier. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.